John Kennedy was threatened by Elizabeth Warren, but then Kennedy humiliated her with one sentence. The Senate chamber simmered with tension, the atmosphere heavy with unspoken rivalries and the low hum of anticipation. Rows of polished mahogany desks shone beneath the soft glow of chandeliers, each one occupied by senators whose eyes flicked between their notes, tablets, and one another, sensing a storm forming beneath the surface. The session had been called to discuss the allocation of disaster relief funds, a subject tied to the raw pain of millions still suffering from catastrophic floods across the country, especially in Louisiana. John Kennedy, the senator representing Louisiana, sat calmly at his desk, his posture relaxed while his sharp blue eyes quietly studied the room with the alertness of a man who had faced many tempests, both literal and political. His hands rested lightly on a pile of papers, his fingers tapping in a steady rhythm that revealed none of the fire simmering within. Kennedy was well acquainted with the rough nature of Senate debates, yet nothing could have prepared him more than anyone else for the outburst that was about to erupt. As the chamber grew still, a sharp scraping noise cut through the quiet as a chair slid across the polished floor. Senator Elizabeth Warren rose, her presence immediately commanding attention, her eyes blazing with a fire that seemed to ignite the air around her. She gripped a thick file tightly, her knuckles white, and when she spoke, her voice sliced through the room like a blade. "Senator Kennedy," she began, her tone heavy with accusation, "the American people deserve answers. Why have you stayed silent while Louisiana drowns in the aftermath of devastating floods? While families lose their homes, their livelihoods, their loved ones? Or are you so tied up in political alliances that you can no longer speak for those you swore to serve?" A collective gasp spread across the chamber as senators froze, pens hovering above their notepads while the impact of her words settled like a gunshot. Reporters seated in the gallery leaned forward eagerly, fingers racing across keyboards as they began drafting headlines. This was not a simple criticism. Warren's assault was a calculated move designed to publicly shame Kennedy before his colleagues, the press, and the nation watching live on C-SPAN. Social media instantly lit up with hashtags accusing Kennedy as users began analyzing her remarks in real time. Warren didn't pause for a moment. She slammed the file down on her desk, the sound echoing like thunder. She declared that Kennedy had stayed silent when communities in his state were begging for help. Silent when children drank polluted water because the infrastructure had failed them. Silent when entire towns were wiped out by floods that better funding might have prevented. She demanded to know whether his loyalty to his party had blinded him to the needs of the people who had elected him. A few of her allies broke into applause, their clapping sharp and intentional, while the rest of the Senate remained strangely silent. All eyes shifted to Kennedy, waiting to see whether he would falter or deflect. Cameras zoomed in to capture every tiny shift in his expression, but Kennedy did not move. His face stayed calm, almost peaceful, as though he were sitting back home on a Louisiana porch rather than being targeted in the middle of a political attack. Yet beneath that calm exterior, something deep and steady stirred inside him. His thoughts returned to the times he had waded through knee-deep floodwater in Baton Rouge, his boots soaked and his heart heavy as he listened to families describe their losses. He remembered Mary, an elderly woman whose home had been destroyed, her trembling hands clinging to his as she spoke of her grandson who had been lost to the floodwaters. Kennedy had been there, not for publicity, but in quiet moments when despair hung thick in the air. He had held hands, made promises, and carried the burden of those stories back to Washington. And now Warren was accusing him of abandoning the very people he had sworn to protect. The boldness of the accusation burned inside him, yet he stayed silent, waiting. Warren intensified her confrontation, her voice rising as she pointed at him and demanded, "Answer the question, Senator Kennedy. Why have you stayed silent while your constituents suffer? Asterisk, why have you failed to demand accountability for the mismanagement of relief funds? Or is it easier to stay quiet and protect your political friends? The chamber was a pressure cooker now, the tension so thick it seemed to hum in the air. Reporters scribbled furiously, their pens scratching like insects. A few senators shifted uncomfortably in their seats, sensing that Warren was playing a dangerous game. She was betting on Kennedy's reputation as a folksy, understated figure, a man of quips and charm, not raw confrontation. She expected him to deflect with a joke, to sidestep her accusations with his trademark Southern wit. But she had miscalculated. Kennedy knew this wasn't just about him. It was about the people of Louisiana, the families still living in trailers, the children drinking bottled water because their taps ran brown. It was about the truth, and he wasn't going to let Warren's theatrics bury it. Slowly, deliberately, Kennedy rose from his seat. The chamber fell silent, the air charged with anticipation. He adjusted his tie, a small gesture that seemed to ground him, and took a deep breath. His eyes locked onto Warren's, steady and unyielding, like a hunter sizing up his target. When he spoke, his voice was low and steady, carrying the weight of a man who had seen too much to be intimidated by grandstanding. "Senator Warren," he said, each word measured, "where were you when the people of Louisiana were begging for help in the floodwaters, while you were busy sipping wine at Georgetown dinner parties?" The silence that followed was deafening. It was as if the air had been sucked out of the room. A senator's pen clattered to the floor, the sound echoing in the stillness. A reporter in the gallery gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Warren's face drained of color, her lips parting as if to respond, but no words came. Her hands trembled slightly, clutching the edge of her desk for support. The chamber was frozen, every eye on her, waiting for a comeback that never materialized. Kennedy's words weren't just a rebuttal. They were a precision strike, exposing a truth everyone in the room knew but no one dared to voice. Warren hadn't been to Louisiana during the floods, not once. While Kennedy had walked through devastated neighborhoods, listening to survivors and promising action. Warren had been hundreds of miles away attending high-profile fundraisers with elite donors in Washington. D.C., the cameras caught it all. Warren's stunned expression, Kennedy's unwavering gaze, the senators glancing at one another in disbelief. Social media erupted with clips of Kennedy's single sentence spreading like wildfire. Hashtags like Kennedy slams Warren and Louisiana truth trended within minutes as users posted messages of shock and admiration. Did he just say that? One tweet read, accompanied by a clip of Warren's frozen face. Kennedy just spoke for every forgotten American, another user wrote. Warren thought she could bully him. She wasn't ready for this. In the chamber, the aftermath was palpable. A few of Warren's allies tried to rally, whispering to her and urging her to respond, but she remained rooted to the spot, her notes forgotten. She flipped through her file as if searching for a lifeline, but her hands were shaking and unsteady. Kennedy, meanwhile, didn't gloat. He didn't need to. He sat back down, his hands folded calmly on his desk, but his eyes never left Warren. There was no malice in his gaze, only the quiet resolve of a man who had spoken a truth too long ignored. Behind him, a young staffer wiped a tear from her eye, moved by the weight of the moment. She had family in Louisiana, people who had lost everything in the floods. And Kennedy's words felt like a vindication of their pain. The reporters in the gallery were in a frenzy now, their phones buzzing with notifications as newsrooms across the country scrambled to cover the story. Anchors on cable news interrupted their segments to play the clip, their voices tinged with awe. Senator John Kennedy just delivered a moment we haven't seen in Washington in years. One commentator said, asterisk, this wasn't politics. This was personal. But for Kennedy, it was more than personal. It was a reckoning. He thought of Mary, the grandmother who had lost her grandson, her voice trembling as she begged for answers no one could give. He thought of the countless others he'd met in Louisiana, their faces marked with grief and resilience. They weren't just statistics in a disaster report, they were his people. Now he would not allow their suffering to be turned into a political weapon. As the chamber slowly began to stir again, senators whispering to one another, Kennedy stayed still, his mind racing, but his expression composed. He knew this was only the beginning. Warren's attack had been a mistake. But she remained a powerful adversary, with strong allies who wouldn't let the moment pass quietly. The folder resting on his desk, slipped to him by a trusted aide, contained more than notes. It held evidence, receipts, and truths capable of shaking Washington's foundations. But Kennedy didn't open it yet. He let the silence work, letting Warren's shocked expression speak louder than anything he could add. The nation was watching, and for the first time in a long while, they were hearing a voice that didn't speak for power, but for them. When the gavel finally fell to adjourn the session, the air in the chamber still crackled with the lingering weight of Kennedy's words. Warren gathered her papers with stiff, uneasy movements, her face set in a mask of fragile shock as she avoided eye contact. Kennedy stood and walked out with steady steps, his heart heavy but resolute. He wasn't fighting for himself. He was fighting for Louisiana, for Mary, for every family forgotten in the floodwaters. And with one sentence, he had made the nation listen. The echoes in the Senate chamber had barely faded when the country erupted. John Kennedy's single sentence, Senator Warren, where were you when the people of Louisiana were begging for help in the floodwaters, while you were busy sipping wine at Georgetown dinner parties, ignited a firestorm that spread far beyond Washington's marble walls. News networks replayed the clip endlessly as anchors analyzed every word, pause, and flicker of emotion on Warren's face. Social media exploded with hashtags like Kennedy slams Warren and Louisiana truth, climbing rapidly to the top of trending lists and gathering millions of views within hours. Ordinary Americans, truck drivers in Mobile, teachers in Shreveport, retirees in Baton Rouge shared the video with emotional comments like, "Finally, someone's calling out the elites," and "Kennedy just spoke for every small town left behind." But the real storm was only beginning as the truth behind Kennedy's statement began unraveling a web of neglect and misdirection stretching deep into the halls of power. In the following days, journalists from major outlets like the New York Times to independent bloggers on X dug into Warren's record, searching for proof to challenge or validate Kennedy's claim. What they uncovered was damning. Public records showed that during the peak of Louisiana's flood crisis, Warren had attended not one but 4 major fundraisers, 2 in Washington, 1 in New York, and 1 in Boston. Photos appeared online showing Warren in a tailored suit at a Georgetown gala, smiling and clinking glasses with donors while Louisiana families waded through toxic floodwaters. Not a single public statement from her office mentioned the disaster during that crucial time. The contrast was glaring, and the public's anger was unmistakable. Posts on X surged with messages like, "She was drinking wine while our homes were underwater." One Louisiana resident wrote, attaching a photo of her destroyed living room, "Kennedy's right, she wasn't there." The revelations deepened a growing sense of betrayal. Not only in Louisiana, but across America, where many saw her absence as part of a wider pattern of political neglect. Back in his Senate office, John Kennedy sat quietly, the full weight of the moment settling over him like a heavy fog. Asterisk, he wasn't one for the spotlight, despite his knack for sharp-witted soundbites. The folder on his desk, handed to him by a trusted aide named Clara, held more than just notes. It contained a report compiled by a whistleblower from the Federal Emergency Management Agency. The document detailed how $1.8 million in disaster relief funds, earmarked for Louisiana's infrastructure repairs, had been quietly redirected to a cultural arts initiative in Massachusetts. A project tied to a nonprofit with close links to one of Warren's major donors. Kennedy's fingers traced the edges of the folder, his jaw tightening as he read the numbers again. $1.8 million that could have rebuilt levees, restored water systems, or saved homes. Instead, diverted to a program that funded abstract sculptures in a city untouched by floods. He knew the implications of bringing this to light. It wasn't just about Warren. It was about exposing a system that prioritized political favors over human lives. But Kennedy also knew he couldn't stay silent. Not now. Not after he'd seen the faces of the people in Louisiana. Their eyes hollow with grief, their hands calloused from rebuilding, with no help. He thought of Anna, a mother he'd met in a flooded parish, her voice breaking as she described losing her teenage son to the raging waters. "He was trying to save our dog," she'd told Kennedy, her hands trembling. "No one came to help us." Kennedy had knelt beside her, promising to fight for answers, and that promise now burned in his chest. The next Senate session was a powder keg waiting to ignite. As Kennedy took his seat, the chamber buzzed with nervous energy. Senators whispering to one another, their glances darting between Kennedy and Warren, who sat rigidly at her desk, her face a mask of controlled fury. The agenda listed dry budget reviews and procedural votes, but Kennedy had other plans. When the floor opened for comments, he stood, holding the whistleblower's report in one hand, his voice steady but carrying the weight of a man who'd had enough. "I'm not here to point fingers for sport," he began, his southern drawl cutting through the room's tension. "But I'd like to know why $1.8 million meant for Louisiana families, for clean water and safe homes, ended up funding statues in a state that didn't see a drop of floodwater." The chamber fell silent. The kind of silence that feels like the world holding its breath. Warren's head snapped up, her eyes narrowing, but Kennedy didn't pause. "This isn't about politics," he continued, holding up the report. "This is about Anna, who buried her son because the levees failed. This is about families drinking bottled water because the pipes are still broken. This is about accountability." He set the report down, his gaze sweeping the room and briefly meeting Warren's before moving on. The impact was immediate. Senators shifted uneasily, some flipping through their notes, others staring at their desks. Warren stood, her voice sharp but unsteady. "Senator Kennedy, these accusations are reckless and unfounded," she said, gripping her podium. "I've dedicated my career to fighting for the vulnerable, and to suggest otherwise is a cheap political stunt." But her words lacked conviction, and the room felt it. A few allies clapped weakly, their applause drowned by murmurs of doubt. Reporters in the gallery were already typing, headlines forming. "Kennedy exposes misdirected disaster funds." Outside the chamber, the story spread like wildfire. In Louisiana, community centers and churches filled with residents watching live streams of the session on battered TVs. Anna, the mother who'd lost her son, sat in a folding chair at a local church, her eyes fixed on the screen. When Kennedy mentioned her name, she covered her mouth, tears streaming down her face. He remembered. She whispered to the woman beside her, "He's fighting for us." The video of her reaction, recorded by a local journalist, went viral, gathering thousands of shares. "This is what leadership looks like," one commenter wrote. "Kennedy's not just talking, he's naming names." Asterisk, the public's response wasn't limited to Louisiana. Across the country, people began sharing their own stories of neglect. Communities forgotten after hurricanes and towns left on their own after wildfires. Kennedy's words struck a deep chord of frustration, a belief that the system had favored the powerful over the powerless for too long. On X, a woman posted a photo of the flooded street outside her home with the caption, "This is my home." Where was Warren? "Thank you, Kennedy, for asking the question we've all been screaming." and the post was retweeted thousands of times, echoing the demand for accountability. In Washington, Warren's team rushed into damage control. Senior aides gathering in a private office, urgently whispering about the media, digging into the nonprofit and uncovering names, dates, and donor lists. Warren sat silently, pale and tense. Knowing the nonprofit was tied to a longtime supporter who had hosted the Georgetown fundraiser she'd attended during the floods. She hadn't questioned the redirection of funds at the time, seeing it as a favor for a loyal ally. But under the glare of Kennedy's accusation, it now looked like a betrayal. She tried to deny direct involvement, yet the evidence grew. Public records showed her office approved the transfer. An email suggested she knew about the nonprofit's connections. Pressure mounted, and even close allies began to pull away. Senator Margaret Holmes, a longtime friend, quietly urged Warren to confront the issue, saying the documents didn't lie. Warren's usual confidence faded. The chamber no longer felt safe. It was a battlefield, and Kennedy had changed the momentum. The turning point came during a late-night session when Holmes rose. Her voice, steady but shaken, and called for an immediate investigation into the disaster relief funds linked to Warren's office. The motion stunned the Senate. Members gasped and turned toward Warren as the vote was taken, and hands from both parties went up, passing the motion with a rare 2/3 majority. Warren sat frozen, ashen and hollow-eyed, realizing her career now hung by a thread, while the nation watched and reacted. In Louisiana, a New Orleans community center hosted a vigil for flood victims where residents shared their grief. Anna, the mother who had lost her son, told the crowd that Kennedy hadn't just criticized Warren, gave her child a voice and spoke for all of them. The crowd applauded through tears. And a pastor handed Anna the letter she had written to Kennedy, asking her to read it aloud. The simple, heartfelt note thanked him for remembering her son and for standing up for families like hers, ending with a plea not to stop. That night in Washington, Kennedy received the letter from Clara, his aide, whose eyes were red with emotion. He read it slowly, feeling the weight of every word. Knowing Anna's loss was only one among many buried beneath bureaucracy and political maneuvering. Kennedy folded the letter with care and placed it in his desk drawer beside a small, worn photo of his childhood home in Louisiana, a modest house that had once been flooded. He wasn't fighting for headlines, applause, or even for himself. He was fighting for Anna, for her son, and for everyone who had ever been told their pain didn't matter. As the night went on and the storm refused to ease, newsrooms scrambled to keep up as reports grew more detailed with every new piece of evidence. A leaked email from Warren's office, published by an independent journalist, confirmed that her staff had known about the diverted funds. And it soon emerged that a close friend of Warren's sat on the nonprofit's board. A revelation that sent shockwaves through the media. Talk shows debated the scandal, calling it a wake-up call for Washington. But Kennedy understood the battle was bigger than one senator or one scandal. The truth he had exposed was only the beginning. Looking out at the Capitol dome glowing against the night sky, he felt the weight of what still lay ahead. The folder on his desk held more secrets, more truths yet to surface, and John Kennedy, with the calm resolve of someone who had seen too much to retreat, was ready to continue. His words had not only silenced a room, they had stirred a nation. That single sentence, spoken with quiet conviction, had humbled Senator Elizabeth Warren and ignited a movement that spread far beyond the Senate's marble walls. The country was captivated not by political drama, but by the raw honesty of a man who spoke for the unseen. Kennedy's steady gaze and southern drawl replayed on television screens from Louisiana to Montana, while talk shows paused their usual chatter to play the clip in full. The silence after Warren's stunned reaction louder than any analysis. Online, the hashtag Kennedy Speaks For Us trended for days. gathering millions of posts from flood survivors sharing their pain and from strangers thanking him for giving them a voice. A nurse from Shreveport wrote that for the first time she felt seen when Kennedy confronted Warren. The nation wasn't just watching a scandal. It was witnessing a reckoning, a moment when the forgotten demanded recognition. Kennedy didn't bask in the attention. As newsrooms chased interviews and pundits praised him as a new kind of hero, he quietly left Washington, boarding a small plane to Louisiana without announcements or press. He traveled to Monroe, a small town still scarred by floods that relief funds hadn't yet touched. In a dimly lit community center, seated on a folding chair among residents who had lost homes, businesses, and loved ones, Kennedy listened as a fisherman named Tom told how the floods had taken his boat. His only livelihood asterisk, he nodded as a grandmother named Atta spoke about bathing her grandchildren with bottled water because the pipes were still full of silt. These weren't campaign sound bites. They were stories that weighed on Kennedy like stones in his chest, each one reminding him why he had spoken up. "I'm not here to make promises I can't keep," he told the crowd, his voice gentle but steady. "I'm here to make sure your voices aren't drowned out again." The room erupted in sincere applause, not the polite kind from Washington, but the raw gratitude of people long ignored. Back in the Capitol, Elizabeth Warren struggled with the fallout. The Senate's vote to investigate her office's disaster fund handling sent shockwaves through her circle. And once loyal allies vanished, their chairs empty and phones unanswered. Alone in a dim office, Warren stared at a draft statement admitting no direct guilt but acknowledging failures in her office. She wrote that she believed she was serving the greater good, but now saw the harm caused. When she delivered the brief, hollow statement to reporters, her voice lacked fire, and cameras captured a woman diminished by the weight of her choices. Headlines were harsh, announcing her step down from key committees and calling it a reckoning driven by Kennedy's truth. Yet her final words surprised many as she said she didn't agree with Kennedy's methods, but respected his commitment to his people, a rare moment of humility. Meanwhile, Kennedy's stand inspired action far beyond one senator's fall. In Louisiana, survivors formed a group called Voices of the Flood to demand accountability. Wearing shirts printed with Kennedy's question, "Where were you when the people of Louisiana were begging for help?" Schools showed the Senate exchange in civics classes to teach integrity. In Baton Rouge, a shy student named Lily said Kennedy made her feel like they mattered. Later, drawing him with a sign reading, "You spoke for us," which her teacher mailed to his office. Kennedy hung it on his wall after reading Lily's note, saying he was the first to care enough to fight. The movement spread nationwide as people saw it as a call to action. Workers, wildfire survivors, and church pastors echoed his words, and even late-night hosts spoke of it with respect. It wasn't about politics, but a longing for leaders who valued people over power. Kennedy felt the burden. One quiet night in his D.C. office, he read hundreds of letters from across the country, a farmer who lost crops, a nurse who lacked supplies, all thanking him for speaking truth. One letter from a retired teacher named Clara in New Orleans, saying she no longer felt forgotten, moved him deeply, and he placed it beside Lily's drawing. He wasn't seeking fame. He was seeking justice, knowing the fight continued. When he returned to the Senate, the atmosphere had changed, carrying new respect for what he represented. Senators who once brushed him off now acknowledged him, and even opponents couldn't deny his impact. In a calm moment before a vote, longtime moderate Senator James Rowley approached Kennedy. "John," Rowley said quietly, "I've been here 20 years, and I've never seen anyone shift the conversation the way you did. You didn't just call out Warren, you called out all of us." Kennedy nodded with a faint smile. "It's not about me, Jim. It's about them," he replied. And no one needed him to explain who them meant: the forgotten people of Louisiana and America. The legacy of Kennedy's words grew stronger every day as news outlets exposed more cases of misdirected disaster relief, revealing a pattern that stretched beyond Warren's office. Grassroots campaigns demanded audits nationwide, and a bipartisan Senate group proposed an oversight committee to ensure relief reached those who needed it most. A move Kennedy quietly backed, but his heart remained at home. At a crowded Lake Charles town hall, he spoke without notes, and afterward Lily, the young artist, handed him a new drawing showing him surrounded by grateful families. Fighting back emotion, he told her to keep drawing and promised he'd keep fighting, as the crowd cheered a man who made them feel heard. Meanwhile, Warren's office grew silent as investigations uncovered donor meetings, emails, and choices that revealed neglect. Avoiding the Senate floor, she watched footage of Kennedy with Lily and felt tears rise, not for lost power, but for realizing how far she'd drifted from the people she once vowed to protect. Kennedy's sentence had become a national symbol, not just of one scandal, but of a system that forgot its purpose. His office was flooded with letters, drawings, and even a quilt stitched with stories of loss and hope. A veteran wrote that Kennedy felt like one of us, while a Florida mother thanked him for fighting for the little guy. These messages were more than praise. They were a mandate. One night, Kennedy looked out at the glowing Capitol dome. Holding Lily's drawing in one hand and Clara's letter in the other, feeling the heavy trust that now fueled him. He hadn't intended to ignite a movement, but his words had sparked a fire for change. And the sentence that humbled Warren had become a promise, one he meant to keep for Lily, for Clara, and for every silenced voice.